Just a few days ago, China's President Xi Jinping invited a host of world leaders, foremost among them Vladimir Putin, to attend an extravagant military parade in Beijing. The event itself, while well choreographed and extravagant in scale, was not unusual in and of itself. After all, US President Donald Trump had insisted on his own military parade in Washington, D.C. in June of this year, after having attended one of France's annual Bastille Day parades all the way back in 2017. But that image of Xi alongside Putin, as well as various other leaders not aligned with the American-led Western global order, such as North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, it was significant for what it represented. Some have interpreted the imagery, the ceremony, the celebration as an indication of what a non-liberal world order might look like, a China-led world order rather than one led by the United States. But I don't think what we are seeing in Beijing, and in an accompanying summit in the city of Tianjin, is the beginning of the end of an American-led Western order. I think that story has already started, and we're right now in the middle of it. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Welcome to the first episode of a new season of The Lead. I'm not sure exactly where future historians will trace the beginning of the end of America's unipolar moment to, but my personal belief is that it will be traced to the invasion of Iraq. I think historians surveying this period will say that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the US was the preeminent global power, but that the Iraq invasion so distracted the US from that global role and pulled it so far into an overreached posture that by the time the US extricated itself from Iraq and the wider war on terror, China had had a decade to quietly build up its power, and we were already in a multipolar world. I don't think that these changes are obvious in moments. I think they become obvious over years and over decades. Many historians have traced the end of Britain as a superpower to the Suez Crisis and the 1956 war against Egypt. But Britain remained a global power into the 1990s and remains a powerful country today. And there were many moments when the decline could have been reversed. That's also how I see the US-led liberal order. If we are in the midst of its decline, that doesn't mean it can't be reversed. For the first episode of the new season, this seems like a good place to start. Because in a way, the perceived retreat of the US liberal order lies behind so many of the topics that we've discussed on the show last season and will come back to. Right at the beginning of last season, we had the realist thinker Robert Kaplan on the podcast. He's the last person to want a decline in American power, but that's incontrovertibly what he believed we are witnessing.
American power is exercised not just by presidential instinct and decisions, but by the decisions made below in the bureaucracy 24 hours a day, all over the world, because as a de facto empire, America has crises every day in Azerbaijan and Cyprus and Georgia and Sierra Leone. There's all these crises you never read about, but which the so-called deep state manages and manages well.
Yeah.
And with Trump, you're going to get much less of that.
Now, surprisingly, you are in favor of the deep state. The term deep state is often used in a derogatory fashion, but you don't think it is a problem. You call it the silent mechanism of American power.
Yes, yeah. I think most people who criticize it don't know it. I mean, they really don't know what they're talking about in many instances. And you cannot be a great power without a great bureaucracy. The British Foreign Office, like it or not, was a very effective means of governance for centuries. And so you need that. And if you don't have that, you're going to get crises around the world below the radar screen that the United States does not properly engage in. And that will lead to a diminution of American power.
Kaplan and I differ in where we see the exact causes of this decline. For him, he sees a change in the nuts and bolts of how American power is exercised, and maybe even in the type of politician doing the exercising. I'm more of the opinion that the change of the liberal order came about because of what the liberal order did, or, as in the case of the rubble of Gaza, did not do. I'm going to come to that shortly. But I think another conflict, that in Ukraine, demonstrates much better just how rapidly the multipolar world is coming about. The war in Ukraine is a war of aggression, but it's also a war of ideas. Ukraine is the current focal point for a longer political reorientation that has been underway since the fall of the Soviet Union, as I discussed with the historian Luka Ivan-Jukic recently.
This word Central Europe, where, in the past, in the 19th century, it described a certain place, kind of fell out of fashion and then re-emerged in the 1980s and, continues to have a certain relevance today when it comes to, say, Ukraine, as I wrote about a few years ago. But yes, this kind of fundamental, almost this geopolitical tension in broadly Europe's east, caused by this large Soviet sphere of influence that has now become a kind of far smaller Russian sphere of influence, and how that has kind of interacted with the identities and politics of the various countries in the region that have, fallen under that influence. And, their attempts of intellectuals and politicians and, also ordinary people in those places to almost reconceptualize their place in Europe and their place in the world in reaction to various events.
The Ukrainians are trying to reconceptualize their role in Europe, their space in the world. But even as they are doing so, the Russians are doing the same. I think this is the part that we sometimes miss in the Ukraine story, that the Russians are also telling a story about what the invasion means, and it is getting a hearing all around the world. The writer Timothy Snyder wrote in the Financial Times recently that Vladimir Putin is the author of the worst war of our century. Here he is on MSNBC recently.
There's been for 3.5 years an illegal war of aggression. Mr. Putin is an indicted war criminal. His armies have destroyed entire cities. They've kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian children for brainwashing and re-education. They've killed hundreds of thousands of people. The attacks on civilians are ongoing. This is the great crisis of our time.
It won't have escaped observers that 3 of the most powerful non-Western countries, Russia, India, China, met in Tianjin, and that they are all involved in the Ukraine war. And not just involved, they are considered complicit by the West. Russia, of course, as we heard in that clip. But India was just tariffed for buying Russian oil, and China is in the midst of its, quote, no limits partnership with Russia. The Ukraine war has become a kind of stress test for the liberal international order, a war not just over borders or sovereignty, but over which system gets to define legitimacy, justice, and power. For Western governments, the war is framed as a defense of the rules-based order. But for others, it's an opportunity to challenge the idea that those rules were ever neutral, or even truly global to begin with. And this isn't anti-Western propaganda coming out of the Kremlin. Here's Queen Rani of Jordan speaking last year.
Yet, what is the global South supposed to think when they see the West stand up for the people of Ukraine while leaving innocent civilians in Gaza to unprecedented collective punishment? What are they to think when global leaders express outrage at airstrikes on foreign humanitarian workers, but not on the desperate Palestinians those same aid workers are trying to support?
The Russians, the Chinese, perhaps soon the Indians, they are all telling a story about what the Ukraine war means. When these global South leaders met in Beijing last week, they were there to celebrate China's Victory Day, the day in September 1945 when Japan surrendered and World War II in Asia came to an end. Vladimir Putin was there, despite the fact that Russia doesn't celebrate the end of World War II in September, but 4 months earlier in May. Countries can tell different stories about the same set of events. And that's what's happening in Ukraine. And it's being believed. Ece Temelkuran is a writer on authoritarianism and a returning guest to the podcast. She's often hugely critical of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And yet, listen to her in this episode.
This is the power of these leaders. You can agree with Erdogan about Gaza,
Right.
You see?
Right.
You can agree with, even with Putin, I'm like, I don't believe I'm saying this. You can agree with Putin about some global south statement that he's doing.
Right.
Or
right.
Iranian leader, Ahmadinejad, former leader, Ahmadinejad was using the words that we produced in World Social Forum in 2003 at some point.
Right.
And since then, such leaders are using a narrative that is actually taking its elements from leftist discourse sometimes.
Yeah.
And
you see that a lot, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they have the courage to do this only because of the hypocrisy of the Western establishment. I mean, like, they have the courage to do this because, for instance, now Gaza is bombarded, and that bombardment is supported by the Western, power mongers.
Right. Yeah.
And now you can hear Erdogan, such a leader with fascist inclinations, talking about Gaza, and then you find yourself in the same camp. So what do you do about it? And they use such words that actually feels like I am they are stolen from me. They're talking about justice. They're talking about this and freedom.
Just as I said that countries can tell different stories about the same set of events, so they can also see different acts as exemplifying different worldviews. For Western Europe today, the war in Ukraine exemplifies the unity and responsiveness of the West. It demonstrates to the West that this is the best version of ourselves, a version that refuses to accept Russian aggression against an ally and refuses to allow territory to be taken by force. And yet, just as Ukraine exemplifies a worldview to Europeans, so Gaza exemplifies a worldview to the global South. The world, the majority of the world, looks at the destruction in Gaza and looks at its own history and says that is what the Western order is all about. More than anything, that is the great danger of the decline of the liberal order. It dies not in darkness, but simply by being ignored. I mentioned at the top of the episode that I think historians will view Iraq as the conflict which brought about the beginning of the end of the American-led world order. But for much of the world, Gaza is the conflict in which it is demonstrated incontrovertibly that such an order never existed, that the world of force being the only currency, a world Putin recognizes and a currency he trades in, is very much the one America and its allies live in. You heard in our last episode a rerun of my conversation with Omar Al-Akkad, in which Omar conceded that he could no longer align himself with the liberal Western order as a direct result of the Gaza war. And he's not the only one. Here's what the former CNN correspondent Arwa Damon had to say on the podcast recently.
If you look at all of it, the lack of humanitarian aid, the level of suffering that has increased, the crippling of missions that are trying to get into Gaza, the targeting of locations that are meant to be deconflicted, and the ongoing targeting of distributions and hospitals and medical facilities, it's part of, or feels like it's part of, an overall strategy to scare people away from going to Gaza.
Yeah, even there, you're using caveats. You say it seems like it's
because
not,
I think
it is a strategy.
Because part of your brain doesn't want to accept that level of it, because part of your brain is saying, no, it can't be. Not in the 21st century.
We accept it from the Russians. We accept that the Russians were doing those things deliberately.
We do.
So why the caveats?
I think maybe it's because we, or a lot of us, we still want to buy into this idea of democratically elected nations and
the values of the West.
Somehow, has a higher value, because if that is all of a sudden as gone, as we actually do all know that it is, we do know that it is. But again, this is where you get into the psychology of it's so hard to accept that those values are actually so fake. And yet there is a part of me that wants to hold on to this idea of, no, there are values and norms in this world, even if those who are meant to uphold them don't. Like, I have to. Our headspace is not, it's not this neat, clean space.
Yeah.
And the thing is expected behaviors, we become accustomed to expected behaviors from the Russians, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, Saddam Hussein back in the day, Gaddafi, you name it.
But why do you put those groups in one category and the other groups in a different category? And you say with one group, this is what we expect of you. And with the other group, even though they're behaving in a very similar manner, you're still saying, I think you can do better.
Because isn't that what they sell us to a certain degree? And isn't that what it's meant to be? Aren't they, the other group, supposed to represent, in theory, hypothetically speaking, what a better world would look like? A world with free speech, a world with freedom of choice, freedom of movement, freedom of opinion. And the thing is maybe it's that to a certain degree, I believe in the concept and the idea of what a democracy is supposed to represent.
Right.
Even though no nation actually fully represents that.
I want to leave Arwa's words there, because we are all in some way wrestling with political ideals and identities in the wake of the Gaza catastrophe. The sheer weight of the destruction and loss of life, and the live streaming of the conflict, that it's not something that is happening in the shadows. All of that has made these 2 years feel like a rupture, a gap in the moral order, as Omar al-Akkad was saying. We'll come back to that conversation and the consequences of it a lot more in the coming months. You can't consider what the West does abroad without considering what the West does at home. Foreign policy is usually a reflection of domestic policy. In the British example I quoted before, the changes in Britain's role in the world had an impact on the island itself. The domestic population feels the repercussions of a changing world. You can see this very clearly in the West today, although I'm surprised how few analysts explicitly draw the link between the global retreat of liberalism and the febrile politics of the West over the past 20 years. But it makes perfect sense. I actually see it as proof of the idea that the liberal order is retreating, because if there are inconsistencies in the declared ideas abroad, small wonder that citizens will start to find inconsistencies at home. When I brought Farhad Dobaivola onto the podcast to discuss his recent book on free speech, we discussed that tension that splits countries like the US and its allies across the Atlantic on these fundamental issues.
First happens in the early 18th century. Anyway, out of this come two models of free speech that developed in the course of the 18th century that we're still living with in the world today. On the one hand, the main model is that you contrast liberty of expression, which is a good thing, has good purposes and good ends, against licentiousness. Liberty is good freedom, freedom to do good things. Licentiousness is an abuse of freedom. That's the 18th century term, licentiousness. But basically the idea is that you have a right to freedom of expression, but you also have responsibilities not to abuse that. That's the model that is enshrined in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, and indeed in every other law ever passed around the world, except in one country, the United States. The United States model comes out of the alternative set of principles articulated first in 1721 by these two completely obscure London journalists called John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, who wrote a column called Cato's Letters. And they put forward all these kind of easily digestible ideas about religious liberty and political liberty and how we should all live in a modern world that are all derived from other thinkers. Like they're doing kind of easily digestible Locke and Machiavelli and the rest of it. But they also insert this very original, completely new set of essays about freedom of expression, which they put forward as basically an absolute right. They say freedom of expression is the most foundational freedom of all. Upon that depends all other liberty. And the moment governments try to curb the freedom of expression, that's a slippery slope to tyranny. And tyrants always are trying to do that. They're always trying to suppress the people and not let them speak their mind.
And they explicitly draw this parallel between the loss of freedom of speech and the loss of property rights, which again was a big thing at the time.
And slavery. The moment that you impinge on people's freedom of expression, you lead them to slavery. These are, of course, the same kinds of people, as I explore in my book, who are enslaving people on a mass scale and shipping them across the Atlantic.
That's what, in large part, has brought about the rise of Trump. He casts his political opponents, indeed the entire political structure that has been built up over the past decades, as tyrannical, as not allowing people to speak their mind. But that idea that mainstream politicians aren't speaking to the real concerns of people is also what is helping newer, heart-on-their-sleeve politicians like Zohran Mamdani. American voters are tired of the bluster, the linguistic contortions that mainstream politicians perform in order to justify their fairly inconsistent commitment to some of these key issues. Here's my colleague Christine Al-Kholi speaking on the podcast earlier this year about the success of Mamdani in the Democratic primaries for the New York mayoral race.
Literally speaks to those who are directly concerned. I think that it kind of signals this revival of the party for younger voters to what it's supposed to be, especially with something like Gaza. Sometimes the language is very formal. It's steeped in a lot of weight, and it masks what's happening. And for a lot of people, just sort of seeing it for their own eyes on social media or hearing news from on the ground, they can make that kind of distinction. And Mamdani's been really good at being direct and speaking directly to these things.
And precisely because some of the most cherished messages are now suspect and the messengers are no longer trusted, that some of what was previously on the margins has become mainstream. Here's a clip from a conversation I had on the podcast with the journalist Gabriel Gatehouse, who I think is fantastic at reading and interpreting the fringe movements of society. J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller, they are creatures of an online right that was once known as the alt-right. And it represents quite a major current in American affairs. And now these subcultures are really mainstream.
Yeah, it's amazing how that's happened and how quickly that's happened. I mean, quickly, I suppose. They were subcultures in 2016. They then had 4 years in power and then were out of power for 4 years and are now back. And I think back here to stay, really. If you thought Trump's first term was sort of regarded by most of the kind of mainstream establishment as possibly a blip, an aberration in a sort of American politics that was kind of constantly heading upwards to some sort of Fukuyama-esque end of history.
The Obama more perfect union.
Exactly, the more perfect union, the arc of history bending towards justice, etc., etc. I think we now see that the United States is something else entirely, and it is going in that direction.
It's an experiment, Gabriel. I mean, this is the point of
it is an experiment, right? But it's just a different sort of experiment from the one we thought was going on.
We've talked a lot about politics in this essay. And for someone like me, I tend to think of these great global topics in terms of politics, in terms of giving agency to political ideas, institutions, and people. But these enormous global changes that we're talking about don't always come about because of politics. Sometimes there is a momentum to the global order, and it comes not from politics, but from something else. Listen here to my conversation with the Portuguese politician turned journalist Bruno Macias on how China's growing domination in the arena of AI is already changing the way we live. When you talk to people in the West, do you think there is any understanding at how quickly that wave is coming?
No, there isn't. Not just there's no understanding of how quickly it's happening, because, by the way, it isn't happening that quickly, but it could accelerate. But I think the real problem is that there's no understanding or awareness that it is happening. People really think it isn't happening. They think that perhaps some countries are catching up. They're learning a few things from us. But there's no understanding that, in fact, first, they are now doing some things better than us. They're innovating. Second, that with new powers in Asia, the leading ideas, the leading culture, the leading way of looking at the world will also change. It's not that they will become better than us as being Western. The leading ideas of the world will no longer be Western. the hierarchy will no longer be with the West on top. So all this will be extremely traumatic, and perhaps because it is extremely traumatic, there's no awareness or knowledge that it is happening.
You've been listening to The Lead. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. Exploring these big ideas that shape today's world, like the shifting geopolitical dynamics between Russia and China and the United States, is a core part of what we like to do here on The Lead. But just as much, we're interested in the ideas, political, social and cultural, that shape our societies and societies around the world. In the past season, we looked into the rise of the manosphere, how tech and AI is taking over hiring and firing in the modern workplace, and how Sudan's youth will play a major role in bringing about the end of the conflict there. You'll find plenty more episodes like this on the podcast in the coming months. Look out for The Lead, now released every Monday on your favorite podcast app.